Hello and God bless. Too many times in life, people try to influence and exploit our beliefs and ideologies for their own profit, benefit, or desire. Many strangers, family, so-called friends, associates, colleagues, companies, corporations, government agencies, politicians, religions, and religious figures all try to influence our perceptions of reality. Therefore, please be aware that this video on Yeshua ben Yosef should not be believed or taken as true until you research the information for yourself. Let no one tell you what is from what is not even yourself, without properly researching the information first. Lastly, for those who only know in Yeshua through an English version of the New Testament, I want to sincerely apologize to you right now, because you're probably going to get mad and defensive from the theories presented in this video. However, please know that I personally believe that Yeshua is the Messiah and the anointed Christ on earth. I just also believe that Jesus' whole story has been concealed and corrupted for over 2,000 years, and there are dark forces at work that seek to continue to do so. As a result, my only intention for this video is to bring attention to lost or suppressed ideas surrounding Yeshua ben Yosef, Joshua son of Mary, Jesus the Son of Man, that need to be validated from your own research and due diligence. God bless always. Now, our story of Yeshua, the Messiah, begins millions of earthly years ago, when Yeshua first came upon the physical world near the Lyrian star system and existed on the razor's edge of the material and astral worlds of existence, also known as the borderland. You see, it is believed that we live in a planet, and this planet lives within a solar system, and this solar system lives within a galaxy, and this galaxy lives within a universe, and this universe lives within a multiverse, and this multiverse lives within the outermost layer or plane in our known existence, and this seventh outer realm lives beyond a sixth inner layer, and this sixth realm lives beyond a fifth plane, which lives beyond a fourth, that lives beyond a third, which lives beyond a second, that lives beyond the first. Furthermore, within each one of these 7 realms exist 7 sublayers that combine to total 49 states of being in our known existence.
Keeping that in mind, I want to show you a sine wave. Sine waves correspond with light and the electromagnetic spectrum and the vibration of sound. We're all very familiar with this. In this entire reality we're in, every single thing is based on sine waves. All things, your bodies, planets, absolutely everything, are waveform. If you choose this particular way of looking at reality and then superimpose that view over the reality of the harmonics of music, we can begin to talk about dimensions. The dimensional levels are nothing but different base rate wavelengths. The only difference between this dimension and any other is the length of its basic waveform. It's just like a radio set. Turn the dial, you pick up a wavelength. It's the same with dimensions. If you were to change the wavelength of your consciousness, and in doing so change all of your body patterns to a wavelength different from this universe, you would literally disappear out of this world and reappear in the one you were tuned in. It's been theorized that the base rate wavelength that we're currently living in is 7.23 centimeters. As you go up in dimensional levels, the wavelength gets shorter and shorter, with higher and higher energy. As you go down in levels, the wavelength gets longer and longer, with lower and lower energy, more and more dense. In this waveform universe we exist in, there's a very definite place where the next dimensional level exists. Its specific wavelength relative to this one. Most cultures in the cosmos have a basic understanding of this and understand how to change between dimensions. However, because of certain events that happen on Earth, we have all forgotten, but we're about to remember.
Very often when people start to consider these 7 planes of nature within ourselves, for instance, they tend to think of it much like a layer cake. So there's one layer, and then there's another layer, and the two are really rather separate. They just touch at a given point. Probably a better way to consider it would be that these are all really interpenetrating, much in the way that air interpenetrates dense matter, and much in the way that vapor interpenetrates air, and much in the way that light waves and radio waves are surrounding us at the same time. All of these things are operative at every given stage, but according to the way that our awareness is tuned, we're only aware of a small segment of it. And that within each one of these planes of being, there are also 7 subplanes that can be understood and can be experienced.
Thus, while living in the borderland, the conscious being we call Jesus began to innocently interact with the more dense and corporal realities of the material world. And over a long period of time, Yeshua and companions travel all over the universe, but never fully commit to entering it. Then, they come upon our universe, and it was here that they experienced a paradoxical spectrum of vibrational energy that was radically different from anything they had previously encountered. Curious and interested in this phenomenon, they came to the cosmic planes of the Earth and intently observed the various energies that emanated from this space or planet. Over a long period of observation and reflection, Yeshua came to realize that the energies they were sensing were lost spirits that had descended into the physical planes of existence and lost themselves in the process. As a result, Yeshua wanted to help these souls and find a universal solution for all these entrapped souls in the physical world. However, it was at this point in their long collective history that the first major disagreement arose between Yeshua and companions. For Yeshua and some others, they wanted to study and develop an extensive plan that could, as naturally as possible, guide all the fallen beings back to their former astral selves. Nevertheless, the other descending group wanted to remain as neutral as possible in the affairs of other beings. They claimed it was forbidden to establish contact between 2 different levels of reality because of all the factors and possible complications involved. They believed the Earthlings should toil in their own sins and delusions and learn how to overcome their own choices and karmic debt. 3, many doubted their own abilities to defend against the pleasures and dangers of the physical world. For in addition to aiding these lost souls, they would have to control their own will, desires, urges, and temptations. Therefore, it was decided that Yeshua and a few other astral beings would descend into the material world and discover the solution to the questions they seek, while the others would either stay and observe in the borderland or continue their travels in existence. And so, around 10.5 million years ago, Yeshua and some companions began to consciously fall into the more physical planes on the Earth. Now, believe it or not, there are many historical and cultural examples of Yeshua and companions from this ancient time. Yet because of our reluctance to accept things beyond our understanding, we still refer to them as myths, legends, and fantasies, despite the overwhelming evidence that points to the contrary. Here are a few ancient references for these volunteering astral beings. As Yeshua and the Esimi began to dwell on Earth, they started to study the biorhythms and the interactions of the numerous life forms. They did so by using mental or thought-form projections of themselves to simultaneously observe, experience, and record information. These projected thought forms had the appearance of a vortex of energy that swirled and moved around in like a Fibonacci-type sequence. After a certain period of this type of study, it became apparent to the Esimi that the beings on Earth were far more lost than originally expected. Therefore, it was concluded that more direct measures were needed to guide these life forms. So Yeshua and the Esimi began to directly interact, rather than secretly study the fallen beings, and at first, their direct engagement seemed very promising. However, over time, the situation becomes a lot more difficult because the preferred method of guidance was becoming more indifferent to the physical beings. Next, with some hesitation, but still possessed with a deep sense of purpose and meaning, Yeshua proposed a new strategy to help these souls. Yeshua suggested that a group of selected volunteering Esimi, led by Yeshua, would completely descend into the physical world and learn firsthand all the factors and answers they saw. And so, as fate would have it, Yeshua and a small group of companions began to further descend into the material realms, where they would also change the destiny of billions of souls as well. This fallen or materialization process of the Esme occurred just like the other lost souls. They each altered and limited the functions of their 7 chakras into 5 and secreted, perspired, emanated, materialized, extruded a plasmic type of energy from their crown chakra that quickly coalesced and expanded and then transformed into a more physical container for their consciousness. Another way of describing this process is through the origins of a living cell and the act of cell division. For example, the nucleus of the cell grows, changes, and forms into a double cone or spindle within the cell. Likewise, an astral being begins to alter the essence of their current being. And as the double cone spindle approaches the surface, half of it penetrates and protrudes out of the surface of the cell in the form of a so-called polar cell. In contrast, the physical astral beings start to produce a vital plasmic energy that oozes from their aura or from the surface of their more physical bodies. Then, the polar cell dies, but in doing so, it provides an essential nourishment for the cell to continue to develop. As for the beings, instead of dying off, these dynamic polar cells or plasmic energy continues to evolve and develop into a more physical avatar, while their previous astral bodies seemingly fade away in the process. Now, this is why legends of old consistently state that the strength or desire or will for life brought about the end of the golden age on Earth. However, in truth, each being never died. Rather, their consciousness transitioned to a more plasmic or physical being, which brought about the second great age on Earth. Tragically, however, despite the hindsight and extensive preparation for this materialization process, some of the Esme modified their chakras too much, and as a result, they rapidly and uncontrollably descended in the physical world with a total loss of memory, awareness, and intelligence. Much like changing radio stations on a radio, their consciousness and collective memories were completely and abruptly changed when they bravely experimented with their chakras. Nevertheless, despite this horrific event, most members of the Esme were able to safely adjust their chakras and transfer their consciousness into more physical vessels without losing their memories or intellect. However, their added duties and responsibilities helping their lost companions just exponentially increase an already dangerous situation. Then, after all the Esme become more physical plasmic beings, a new era rose on Earth. Yeshua was now called Emilius, and the Esme became known as the legendary Hyperboreans. Before we continue, let us briefly review the Hyperboreans of the Second Age on Earth. Now, in order to build their residences within the Earth, the Hyperboreans had to use their ESP-related abilities because they lacked a physical body to naturally interact with the Earth. These telekinesis powers were known by many ancient names and were part of a multifaceted force that could loosely be described as a specific attunement of transcendent vibrational energy that enables the divine function of free will. The most powerful natural force that sentient beings can use to manipulate and form their given realities. and in the physical world, it is the divine predecessor of the third eye that later became our pineal glands. Thus, using their psychic abilities, the Hyperboreans began to rearrange and form huge underground bases with sacred energy patterns like the Merkaba, which will be discussed later. So for a long time, Yeshua, now called Emilius, and the Hyperboreans continued their guidance in the wayward lives of the fallen from below the surface. However, despite their loving and selfless efforts, the desires of physicality gradually became too enticing, and over a long period of time, the majority of the Hyperboreans started to have personal relationships with the fallen. They started to imitate and interact instead of guiding the life forms towards a more spiritual involution. Eventually, instead of sweating plasmic ooze from their auras, they began to emanate more physicalized nuclei that slowly crystallized around them like a huge cocoon or egg. The only ones that remained unaffected by this materialization process was Emilius and a few others. Then, after too many years of continuous self-indulgence, many of these cocooned Hyperboreans started to hatch from their procreative shells as giant elemental beings whose bodies, the form, color, and texture evolved from their surrounding environment. The Hyperboreans have now become the Proto-Lemurians of the third great age on Earth. At first, the Proto-Lemurians were an extremely diverse group of beings that had members of all different shapes, sizes, and appearances within the Hollow Earth. Furthermore, except for a few later celebrated exceptions, all of them were born with a single collective consciousness that guided them like bees to a hive, for the realization of an individual self or ego had not yet evolved. So now, at this point in the Earth's history, there were the Essimi, the Hyperboreans, and the Proto-Lemurians, as well as the first fallen life forms and the naturally evolving life forms on the surface of the Earth. Then, over another long period of earthly time, two detrimental things occurred simultaneously among the Proto-Lemurians. One was the early stages of self-awareness, and the other was the continuing transformation of their bodies into more earthly beings. They started to innocently question their experiences and slowly build up a new type of self-awareness, as well as a more physical body that adapted to their environment. Now, for those who dwelled near water, their bodies became more liquid. To those who lived by rocks and minerals, they became more rock-like. And for those who mingled with animals, they became more organic and animalistic. Let us now briefly review the third great age of Lemuria. The name Lemuria comes from the 19th century zoologist Philip Scalater, who believed in the existence of a lost continent that stretched from the Indian Ocean to Australia, from Madagascar to parts of Africa. And in January 2017, scientists confirmed this theory but renamed the continent. Now, the main continent of Lemuria is believed to have sunk into the ocean around 85 million years ago. However, a very large remnant still remained above the Indian Ocean until around 200,000 years ago, when a sudden decrease in the Earth's velocity of rotation caused a series of subterranean convulsions that destroyed the largest remnant of ancient Lemuria. Nevertheless, the legendary White Island of Lanka and its fabled mountain that held the sky above the Earth still remained, as well as many other islands of various sizes. However, around 80,000 BC, Lanka and other remnants of Lemuria disappeared into the ocean, leaving only present-day Ceylon, Malta, Madagascar, and other small islands. The third great age of Lemuria can best be categorized into three main parts. A. The sweat-borne life forms of Proto-Lemurians. B. The egg-borne life forms of Lemurians. And C. The womb-borne life forms of Proto-Atlanteans. It also should be noted that when researching alleged events and stories from this age, one must be mindful not to be confused with the various names and descriptions that will ultimately be described for one essential being. For example, let's say there was a member of the Essimi who was called W. Then later, W transformed into a sweat-borne Hyperborean, and it became known as X, since essentially it became a new being with a new body and a new consciousness. Next, X eventually transforms into an egg-borne life form with a new name of Y. Finally, Y slowly changes into a womb-born life form that is then called Z. So technically, W, X, Y, and Z is always the same person and being despite having completely different bodies, personalities, and names. Now, if you take into account that W, X, Y, and Z had different associating groups with different names for these groups too, so hypothetically W is from the group A, and X is from group B, and Y is from group C, and Z is from group D, so one can read about W in group A, and it is a completely different story from Y and maybe group C. Now, when the Proto-Lemurians came into existence, Amelius and others expressed remorse for the very first time in millions of earthly years. They foresaw the potential evils that these new terrestrial beings now possess, and as a result, Amelius and others gathered them all together and prevented them from interfering with the surface world. Nevertheless, self-awareness still spread among the Proto-Lemurians, and eventually they were all relocated to an isolated area on the surface because their materializing biorhythms were greatly affecting the harmony and collectiveness within the inner earth. On the surface, these newly self-aware Lemurians felt completely abandoned and isolated. Not only were they living in a strange new land, but they were also beginning to think independently and had no feelings or sense of their physical bodies yet either. In fact, it wasn't until a long time afterwards that the Lemurians finally gained full control over their mind, body, and feelings, and when they did, they quickly established communal cities, social patterns of predictability, and control over their environment. Here are some cultural examples of the Lemurians that you maybe didn't even know about.
Shreya Kairava Chandrika Vitarana Vidyavadu Jivanana.
Then, sometime during the Third Great Age, a select group of Lemurians migrated to the continent we now refer to as Atlantis and gained a steep advantage over the rest of the evolving life forms on Earth because of the concentration of ley lines of energy in the area, as well as the synthetic grid line of energy that was instilled into the land by psychically inclined Lemurians. As a result, the beings on Atlantis evolved very quickly while also retaining their psychic third eye abilities. Thus, it was at Atlantis where the androgynous egg-born Lemurians slowly devolved into the first hermaphroditic humanoid beings called the Proto-Atlanteans. Now, at the start of the Fourth Great Age, the eternal soul of Emilius, also called Yeshua or Jesus, took responsibility for what was happening on Earth, and despite many warnings of others, descended into a more physical form and restricted consciousness to personally guide the Proto-Atlanteans in their involution on Earth. And so for well over 100,000 earthly years, Emilius and the Atlanteans were a beacon of spiritual, scientific, and civic enlightenment on Earth, and they righteously prevented sin and evilness from pervading into the hearts and minds of others. Nevertheless, after thousands of centuries of peace and prosperity, a fateful day arose when self-interest apart from the whole started to spread like fire in the minds of others. Communal practices and sacred customs were being cast aside, and ever closer relationships were being formed with the naturally evolving animal beings on Earth. Incredibly saddened by these events, Emilius and other still androgynous Atlanteans began to establish altars around the world to remember and honor the one true God. They they started to sacrifice a large portion of every crop that they received to God, and thereby placing God before any self. They also began to set up the first churches or temples on Earth. However, unlike our modern-day sanctuaries, these high-tech facilities allowed numerous life forms to experience out-of-body experiences to remind them of their former selves and realities. Nevertheless, it should be noted that despite their original intent, much later Atlanteans would manipulate and corrupt these altars and hospitals towards more selfish and oppressive means. Then, around 106,100 BC, Amelius committed another sincere but naive act that forever changed the history of the Earth once again. Observing how self-awareness came about more quickly from the increased use of a body, Amelius psychically formed the first automatons, or golem-like beings on Earth, and collectively called them Lilith. These automatons were originally comprised of dirt, rocks, and trees, and were used as workers to prevent others from moving and becoming more self-aware. However, over time, these golems started to show signs of intellect and awareness, and they gradually formed smaller golems from themselves to share in the work. Now, shortly after the automatons were formed, Amelius received a vision to leave the Earth plane and return back to the Lyrian star system in order to prevent a great catastrophe that was unfolding there. Therefore, Amelius appointed Asua as leader and then left his earthly body behind to travel to the Lyrian star system. So when many observed and heard about the creation of the Lilith by Amelius, they too desired automatons for themselves. As a result, numerous golems started to form, and over a long period of earthly time they began to appear like animals, Lemurians, and even Atlanteans for more aesthetically appeasing reasons. However, only the Lilith that were made from the spiritually attuned beings were able to form other automatons from themselves too. Nevertheless, as with all things that Amelius originally intended for on Earth, others would later contort and manipulate for their own benefit, and this in turn would cause the first great schism in Atlantis. One group, later known as the Law of One, wanted to treat the automatons with respect and endearment, while the other group, who later became known as the descendants of Belial, felt that the automatons were non-conscientious things that deserved whatever they wanted them to do. Tragically, this schism only worsened when the golem-like beings unexpectedly began to show further signs of sadness, fear, and shame in their behavior. Then, sometime after the Great Schism occurred, the descendants of Belial started to redevelop Amelius's temple system into a globalized system of forming, harnessing, and storing energy for the use of light, heat, transportation, medical, and many more material functions that were being invented at this time. Then, thousands of earthly years later, after the discovery of an extremely rare quartz crystal, the descendants of Belial transformed their pyramids into the infamous Firestone Towers that were now able to transmit a seemingly limitless supply of energy for whatever desire or purpose they saw. They also had to form huge holes near the facilities that pierced through the earth in order to gain maximum use of the towers and crystal. Coincidentally, after the Firestone Tower system was set up, many Lemurians and even a few Atlanteans began to break sacred laws concerning the earth and other life forms. They began to taste and eat the flesh of already killed animals, and in doing so they noticed a stark difference in energy that they received. Gradually, they began to experiment with eating live animals, and as a result they changed the mentality of all the animals on Earth. In time, the animal world would become increasingly territorial, hostile, carnivorous, and even aggressive towards all other life forms. However, rather than making atonement for their sins against the animals, the Lemurians, Atlanteans, and other beings persuaded Asua and many of the Law of One to use their technologies to eliminate them. Now, never in the history of the Earth has such technology been openly used for such purposes, and as a result, the Second Great Schism occurred because of the disagreements involved in the debate. Nevertheless, Asua was convinced to use the Firestone Towers as weapons, and millions of animals were killed over a short period of time. Now, many still loyal to the Law of One were horrified of this situation and began to rescue, hide, and protect many of the creatures affected by the Firestone Towers. Over time, they also began to have strong feelings and close relationships with many of the animals too. Then at some point, a member or members broke one of the most sacred oaths and customs and began to have sexual relations with the naturally evolving life forms on Earth. From these sacrilegious experiences, a titanic race of hybrid-like beings began to exist and many years later warred against many of the Atlanteans. Now, due to the increase and continuous use of the Firestone Towers, a catastrophic event occurred in our ancient past, when the towers caused the Earth's axis to suddenly shift and the poles to drastically change positions. The whole world experienced earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, as well as drastic changes in the topography, weather, and the environment of the Earth. Most of Lemuria was lost, and Atlantis broke into 7 smaller remnants. Many Atlantean refugees went within the Earth, while others went to the Pyrenees, Himalayas, South America, and others flocked to the island of Pisidia, where an Atlantean named Aslan made the land a beacon of hope and promise to the survivors. As progress and technology evolved after the first destruction period of Atlantis, so did the descendants of Belial and their materialistic desires. Eventually, the separation of knowledge occurred on Earth, and a ruling elite was formed from the resulting inequality of wisdom and information. This was the time of the third great schism of Atlantis. On one side was Aslan of Pisidia and the Law of One, and on the other side was most of the world and the descendants of Belial. Then around 50,722 BC, Asphia, ruler of Egypt, called together a global meeting of nations in order to form some type of treaty or peace among warring parties and establish territorial, commercial, and other international laws that each nation must adhere to or face punishments. However, not even 1,000 years later, in 44,949 BC, an elite group of Bellarians plotted against the Pisidians and the world and sought to gain power through the chaos and misfortunes of others. As a result, they secretly turned the global power system too high and once again disrupted the Earth's poles and axis. Thus, from this time until around 28,000 BC, marked the second destruction period of Atlantis. Great floods and hurricanes overwhelmed the Earth, and the 7 Atlantean islands splintered into even smaller pieces of land. Moreover, new leadership traditions began to form during the second destructive period, and emperors and monarchies began to rise in power. Also, secret societies became widespread, and the channeling of dark souls for guidance became prevalent among the so-called elite. Then around 17,000 BC, the Earth experienced mysterious changes in its weather, environment, and the land, while earthquakes and volcanic eruptions increased dramatically. Rumors began to spread of another great destructive period, and civil wars broke out throughout the world. Next, around 12,000 BC, Aemilius finally returned to Earth from Lyria and called together all the leaders of the world as only Aemilius could. Aemilius informed everyone of his Lyrian experiences and also proposed a worldwide cleansing process so that all reincarnating souls can better adapt and transfer in and out of their physical bodies. Aemilius retaught all the leaders that because there were many hybrid species with humanoid and animal characteristics, many souls that were meant for animal bodies were living as humanoids, and vice versa. Therefore, this had to change, and in order to do so, Aemilius proposed a system of hospitals with high technology that would modify all hybrid-like species as best as possible, and also make sure that they couldn't reproduce anymore. Lastly, Aemilius hoped that all nations would share in the responsibility of making a perfect body or species that would not crossbreed with different species, be able to use high degrees of intellect, be able to express emotions, and be able to live and move in all terrains on Earth. Then, after much debate among the leaders, Aemilius' proposals were eventually agreed upon by most but not all the leaders. As a result, many hospitals were set up, breeding restrictions were implemented, and 5 equal but unique body types were genetically created to be the most predominant vessels for the more evolved souls to reincarnate into, the so-called Adamic or human race. Next, Aemilius and a select group of others volunteered to incarnate into this new Adamic race, and Aemilius transitioned his being into dual aspects or twin souls that became Adam and Eve, while others became legendary figures in other ancient cultures too. Adam and Eve first resided in Pisidia until around 11,670 BC, when they dramatically experienced the events that are represented in Genesis chapter 3. After this event, Adam and Eve relocated to the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains,